Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed. I am your host, Michael Voss, Dragon of the Southern Tier. I'm happy to be here with you today. And we want to do something a little different today. Rather than looking at the news that exists at the moment and commenting on how that is affecting all of us across the world, rather, today we want to take a bit of a theoretical trip. We want to look to the future to see how the major impacts of what has happened in Afghanistan, how is that going to affect our future? What is next? The dominoes are already falling. The question now is, where will these dominoes lead to? What is the next logical things that we can expect to see to happen? Not many really like to address that in politics. Very few like to tell people what could happen next. I think it's important that we absolutely do that. We may well be wrong, but we'd rather go on record and let you know than leave you in the dark. Now, if this is the first time that you have come to the channel, we want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. And we want you to know that we do long-form political commentary. On every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you. We reach out on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, DLive, essentially all social media that the internet overlords will allow, to reach out to you from anywhere in the world to hear your voices and your comments in your chats, your tweets, and your phone calls to tell us what you think about the issues that are happening in the world and how they are affecting you, because we believe in the First Amendment. Even in countries where they don't believe it, we think you have a right to free speech, and we want you to share that with us. So we hope to see you every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To the issue of today, or the question that we're posing, what is next? What are the dominoes that we can see that are going to happen? We know that the Taliban have now taken over Afghanistan. We know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as well as several other Islamic State emirate groups, are now in Afghanistan, and they are growing, and they have taken this victory as an impetus to continue to expand and become larger and to have more influence. This is a fact. It doesn't matter how it happened at the moment. Let's just deal with that is the fact on hand at this moment. We know as a fact on hand at this moment, there are some 60,000 refugees in Afghanistan that are going to be taken by various countries. We're looking at somewhere around 20,000 Afghan refugees that are targeting to be going to the United Kingdom. I think it's about 5,000 to 10,000 that are targeted to Australia. The United States is talking about something between 40 to 50, possibly 60,000 in the United States. These numbers are a bit loose because it's not just the individuals that worked with the United States, such as the interpreters or some of the businesses, and definitely a lot of the politicians that worked hand in hand with the United States and the NATO forces over 20 years in Afghanistan, but it's everyone who wants to get out. Every school teacher that is a woman, every father who fears for his daughter who he doesn't want to see her married off at the age of 15. There's a lot of reasons why people are trying to get out of Afghanistan right now. Individuals who may be LGBTQ plus and face being stoned or thrown off of buildings. And even though the Taliban has made many promises at this moment, saying that they will not return to their fanatical orthodoxy that we have seen them impose before, and we have heard that they are doing even as we speak. There are stories of northern Afghanistan where a 45-year-old woman who is the widow of an Afghan fighter, someone who was on the side of the Taliban, he had died, and they went to that widow's house 3 times, telling her to cook for 15 members of the Taliban. The woman denied them because she didn't have the food. She barely had enough for herself and her 12-year-old daughter. On the 4th time back, well, that's when they killed her and burned down the building. There are terrible stories like this going on right now. So do we believe the Taliban when they say that they will allow women to continue to go to school and learn to read, to hold jobs? No, we don't. I think one of the most recent statements was the Taliban had said that they will respect women to the full extent that the Quran allows. And again, this is their interpretation of the Quran, not necessarily what the Quran actually says. So no one holds many hopes high about what they're promising versus what they will do. But that's the reality of the situation at this moment. So we know there are refugees, and many of them are more than the individuals directly related to the United States itself or the U.S. forces, the occupying forces that were in Afghanistan for 2 decades. So we have refugees to deal with. And that's happening. We have world economics that will be affected. This affects oil fields. This affects the stability in the Middle East. It changes international politics. We see that China is making overtures and have already recognized the Taliban as the leaders of Afghanistan. We know that Iran is directly involved with many of the terrorist organizations that are in Afghanistan at this time, thus allowing them to expand their influence in many of those groups. We know that Pakistan has been a long-term supporter, going back to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, having supported many of the terrorist groups that are in Afghanistan right now, and Pakistan containing many of these Islamic terrorists as well. So that is a factor, and that affects India very directly, as well as challenging the balance of power for several countries. So we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean? How do the dominoes start to fall? What could we see happening next? Because not many people are saying that. Well, one of the things that we think will happen next, and we did put this out on Twitter, and you can see it here, and what we said is, mark my words, Biden-Harris, the Biden-Harris administration will make a deal with Iran in reference to the Iran nuclear deal to have a victory to tout for their progressive wing of the Democratic Party, whom they are trying to impress. And because they need to impress them going into the 2022 midterm elections to try and salvage any kind of hope that it won't be a complete rout for the Democratic candidates. Sanctions, because of that Iran nuclear deal, the one thing that Iran has definitively said they must get to go forward are the lifting of 529 economic sanctions that has held back Iran. While we don't think all of them will be lifted, you could see 300 of the economic sanctions, more than half of them, being removed to appease Iran and to give them some economic freedom. And in exchange of that, you will see that Iran will go forward with the Iran nuclear deal, a la the deal made in 2015. This will fund global terror. This is exactly what happened under then Secretary John Kerry, and he himself said in January 2016 that some of the funding, some of the economic sanctions that were released allowed Iran, the leader of global terror in the world, to expand its efforts on global terror. We see absolutely no difference this time round. And considering that the Biden administration is now under full-scale attack, it is embarrassed, it is weak, it has been exposed as being weak, It is under attack from Democrats and Republicans alike. We've shown this in several videos recently, and polling that we have seen that was done on August 14th and August 15th as the events in Afghanistan were underway by the Trafalgar Group. We will see that global terror will increase. Iran will have the funds. They are emboldened. Joe Biden, the Biden-Harris administration are weak, and so they will go forward. And we will see rising global terror, and it will substantially increase. That means that Israel, France, and U.S. citizens abroad are the first and primary targets of this expansion of global terror around the world, facing attack attacks from the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the various smaller organizations like the PPK, and I know there's a couple of groups like Lakash and Jaish and others that are now looking at this opportunity and saying they're going to go forward. They're going to try and take advantage of this as best as they can. These are troubling events, but they are realistic. This is what we will most likely see. The politics in the United States, the Biden administration's desperation at this moment will last. We can see there will be political attacks for every Democrat that tries to support the Biden-Harris administration going forward, and the midterm elections, which normally reverse the result of a primary election, and you'll see a change in the parties that control the House and the Senate. It's going to be more extreme this time because this is a more extreme loss. This Saigon-like event doesn't have it's not in a vacuum. There are consequences to this, and those consequences are pretty deep. We know and we can envision going forward. The Taliban now is empowered. They have U.S. planes and helicopters. They have U.S. arms and APC carriers and tanks. They have ammunition. They have food. They have logistical areas, regions, fortifications that have been built up by the United States government over 2 decades that they now get to walk into. The communications that the United States had built up over 2 decades, that they now get to walk into that infrastructure and they use it for themselves. This is incredibly empowering. We have a militant, fanatical terrorist organization that gets to walk into a first world infrastructure, military infrastructure, that can only emphasize their danger and their reach and their capabilities. They have been fully armed. They have access to all of the things that they would want, because the United States under the Biden-Harris administration didn't destroy any of this. So that means their reach is that much larger. This is a big deal. What are the dominoes effect? Like I said, there will be Iran, and that will be a factor. And we know that the U.S. politics are going to change because of this, because, as we can see, Congresswoman Claudia Tenney, a friend of this channel, and someone we agree with, made this comment. Joe Biden wants to make it nearly impossible for law-abiding Americans to buy guns. Yet he just armed the Taliban with military-grade weapons at the taxpayers' expense. This is absolutely true. This is a fact. It is irrefutable. There is no question about this. That is what has happened. As we said, the Taliban has now been empowered. They get to take everything that the United States left behind, including all the infrastructure, which I think is actually somewhat more dangerous than the weapons themselves. because it allows them to have a multiplier on their forces that they've never had before. And of course, this is a message that will continue. This highlighting of fact is going to continue into 2022 in the midterm elections. And there is no real defense other than when Democrats say, well, it's President Trump's fault. It's a weak answer and it's not accurate. President Trump isn't in the White House. President Trump did not give orders as commander-in-chief. One of the few things that we agree with in the 18-minute long speech to the United States that Joe Biden made was he stated the buck stops with him. That's because he is the executive of the United States. He is sitting in the Oval Office. This was his plan. As poorly thought out as it was his decision. And most Democrats, most independents recognize this. It is a fact. It isn't a question. It is a reality, and how you wish to react to that reality is an entirely different thing, but that is the reality. And that will affect elections, which then affects where does America go? Do we see a more militant, a more aggressive United States going forward? Do we see a United States government that is going to be more prone to reaction, military reaction, especially in efforts from the Middle East start to influence a larger and larger area? Because one of the dominoes we can definitely be sure of is this is going to impact India. That's a big deal. India is one of our biggest allies. And as we were mentioning before, this poses an extreme challenge to India at this time. We're going to see that the Islamic Emirate, and there are organizations, other terrorist groups, maybe not as popular to most Americans or to the world at large, but yet they still exist. There are Pakistani-based terror groups like Lashkar and Jaish. I'm mispronouncing that. I apologize. Well, actually, I don't. They're terrorist organizations. Are already in Afghanistan, and their influence will only grow. This is a problem for India, as they now have to deal directly with raids and attacks from these groups. Because one of the realities of what we will see is Afghanistan is now the campground, kind of in a way that Libya had been under Muammar Gaddafi. This is now the hotspot for terrorist organizations around the world. Given a little bit of influence from China and or Iran to be able to train these militant terrorist fanatical organizations, all of them, they are then going to be able to embolden and have groups come in, train, and travel around the world. That should trouble people, especially India. It is a very easy trip from going from Afghanistan into India, and the influence of Pakistan and Pakistani fanatical zealots will have an impact there. India is the second largest population in the world. They are trying to develop themselves at a rapid pace, which has resulted in them having the second greatest influence on the climate change and the greenness of the world by many standards. I mean, they're developing, they're expanding, they're trying to become a first world nation. And like China, they are building up and causing more global greenhouse gases. And that's more than the United States can reduce. So this will have an impact on a developing nation that already is a roughly second world nation trying to become a first world nation. That affects the world markets. That affects the economy, the global economy. and the flow of trade around the world, it will have an influence. China needs Afghanistan as a way to export goods to and services to help their economy. So it is an impact there as well. Iran, this is one going, Afghanistan and the groups within Afghanistan are going to be one of their sources that they will use the funds from the lifted sanctions to help enforce. To be able to say, for Iran, we didn't commit global terror. This organization from within Afghanistan under the Taliban, they went out and did the global terror. We just happened to train them. That will be the statement from Iran. And that's a problem. Because what's the difference if you've trained them and told them how to target and who to target, and they go and do it? Isn't it still your fault? Because that's how we've looked at Iran to this day, most of the time. So how can we not look at that again? So within the next 5 years, we can realistically say that we would expect, especially if the Iran nuclear deal goes forward, especially if the Biden administration backs down and releases 200, 300 of the economic sanctions that currently exist against Iran, if those are lifted, that global terror will increase over the next 5 years, probably exponentially so. We will see India being one of the first major nations to take a full brunt of that impact. We will see the influence of Iran and China grow with these militant groups. India is not the only one who's going to be affected, though. We're going to see this affect all of Europe and Great Britain, as well as the United States. But directly, and this is because of the immediate nature. Now, I didn't mention Israel because it goes without saying. Israel is in massive danger. They are a target. They have always been a target since 1947. They are a massive target. And that goes without saying that they are now going to be under severe pressure. Hamas will be empowered now. They will be encouraged now. In seeing the defeat of the United States at the hands of the Taliban, how would Hamas not be encouraged to think that they are much larger, better funded, a better infrastructure? We're going to see them clashing with Israel. That's a problem. That's a major problem. Because they think they can do the same thing. They have seen that the little guy can take down the giant. And if Taliban could do so, why can't they? And that's the message that has gone out to every militant, fanatical, terrorist organization around the world. If you just keep at it, you can take down the giants. They will fold. They will run away. They will get a weak leader, and that leader will fold. And that happens within the next 5 years. We would expect that Hamas will enter into another war. I think this would be the 5th or 6th war against Israel. And we will see that Iran will, of course, back that, and maybe some of the other groups within Afghanistan today will be joining Hamas in those attacks against Israel. And this will be a much larger conflict than the most recent one that occurred in June, July, where we saw for a couple of weeks, and 4,000 Iranian rockets were fired at Israeli women and children. I think the next one will be much, much bigger, and this will be within the next 5 years. But the question is, what about Europe? How is Europe going to be affected? One of the most frequent targets is France. We've seen bombings. We've seen cars and trucks taken over to run over individuals in Paris. We've seen bombings and attacks in Nice. And I think you're going to see more of that. I think that's going to increase. Again, These are militants who, because of the guidelines of the EU, the open border structure that they have, the ease of traveling between one country in the EU to another, and the impetus of the EU to take in refugees from around the world, and especially from the Middle East, it makes the EU, absolutely, the European Union, makes them highly susceptible to infiltration. And these individuals, many of them, they're already, cells already existing. That is a fact. We know this. Those cells will either grow, be empowered, perhaps fortified, and new ones will grow. France has been a hotbed of that front line fighting about that. Greece has had some issues. Germany has many issues with roving bands that are going out and attacking women. But France has had a lot of that front line attack. We expect that they're going to have even more. Again, within the next 5 years, we will see several new large events probably happening in Paris, likely happening in Nice, that will display this newfound infrastructure and supply and training that's coming out of the Afghanistan sector. And that will affect many people in France, sadly. In addition, we could see this also happening in England. While not a member of the EU, they are having part of this problem. And that's because they are now having to deal with a very significant issue. They're taking in refugees. And we know, as we said, they're going to be taking in at least 5,000 of these refugees it's expected to be in the next year or so. There's 5,000 to be taken, and then they're going to be an additional 15,000, possibly 20,000, possibly more. There is no upper limit really at this moment. I mean, looking at Ms. Patel of the British government, she mentions we could end up bringing many more than 20,000. But first of all, we have to have an underpinning and the infrastructure and the support to do that. You see, at the moment, there is a big push from the more liberal, more progressive wings in Britain, as well as in the United States, that say borders must be open and that everyone must be allowed to come in. And refugees, no matter how many are allowed into your nation, obviously there are many people who say, well, we need to slow that down. That's not exactly correct. Fair enough. But what we can say and what we can be sure of is there will be some degree of infiltration. And when you have numbers of 20,000 or more, 30,000, 50,000 refugees, many of these individuals, we see that some of them do not require passports. They're just going to be accepted in. There is some level of infiltration that can exist and will likely happen. And that means that England is looking at, as they go from 5,000 to 20,000 to probably seeing an increase to about 40,000 refugees from Afghanistan. That is realistically what's going to happen. The push by progressives will be large enough. The claim that to not do so is racist will be strong enough along the political lines that you will see them take at least double the number that they are expecting to take now, and probably faster than they expect to take them. And with that speed increases the likelihood of less than desirable elements, terrorists, being included in there. They're slipping in through the cracks, which means we will see not only in France, but in the United Kingdom, some of these terrorist elements. And that means that there will be increased tensions in the United Kingdom and there will be some terrorist actions. We would expect that also within the next 5 years. We could see something similar as well in Australia. Australia is looking at roughly 5,000 to 10,000 of these refugees. Australia having a large but smaller than the United States and Britain, but having a sizable force of NATO troops in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. They too will be having some of this. Now, at the moment, we see New Zealand and Australia are going through rather severe lockdowns due to the pandemic. But as that eases, and more importantly, as the delays in the United Kingdom and the United States delays some of the refugees, or some of the largest numbers of the refugees being resettled, pressure will be put on Australia to accept these individuals, and they will. That will destabilize the balance in Australia. And while I don't think there'll be as many terrorist actions there, because it's a lot harder, because Australia is much more isolated, I do think tensions will go higher, and we will see shifts within the Australian government that will be a reaction to that. Initially, we will probably see a more left-leaning, more progressive movement to get those immigrants in, and that will be countered by, after they have arrived, a much more right-wing, more conservative movement to deal and react to that new influx of refugees with very different cultural ideals than what you see in Australia. That brings us to the United States. What do I see happening there? I think that you will see that the United States, we're going to take probably, at the end of the day, we'll probably take 70, maybe 100,000 immigrants in total from Afghanistan. We're going to do this very quickly. We're going to see large numbers of individuals. I could see in the first year somewhere around 15,000 Afghani refugees coming in. And again, I'm not against this. I don't think this is a bad thing, because we had interpreters, we had members of the military, members of politics and the infrastructure that we worked directly with for 2 decades. And they are under threat. And they will likely be killed the longer that they stay in Afghanistan. Like the Afghani, the first and only female mayor of Afghanistan, she's waiting to die. She's made this statement publicly to the news media. She needs to get out. The United States will probably take her and her family, and do so as quickly as possible. And there are many stories like that that will happen. So we're going to see a surge of about 15,000 individuals. The first question that the United States has to worry about is, where are they going to go? One of the questions we should be asking is, are we sure of everyone that's coming? And I think in the first wave, because these are individuals who worked directly with the United States, that isn't really a question. We have records on these individuals. We have people who can identify them, who have worked with them. We can be relatively sure that that first wave, that first year, those immigrants and refugees will be without question, or very little question. The only question will be, where will they go to? What regions will they grow in? Will they go to New York State? Will they go to Oregon? Will they go to California, Texas, Michigan, Kentucky? I mean, where do they go? And I would think it's somewhere in the Midwest, most likely. Somewhere like a Nevada, a New Mexico, an Oregon, somewhere in those kind of regions. They'll probably disperse a bit, but those will be some of the areas with the largest concentrations, just because of similarity to a certain extent to their homeland. But they're coming, and here's a big thing to understand about refugees. They aren't immigrants. There's a big difference between a refugee and an immigrant. An immigrant, a legal immigrant, is coming into your country because they want to be part of your country. They want to be you. They want to be like you. They want to be part of what you are. That is a legal immigrant. That's not the same thing when you're saying a refugee. A refugee is coming to your country because they have no choice, because there is no other option for them. They're there for their safety. They were driven out of their home. They had a fear of death, not because they didn't like their country or their culture or their religious beliefs or their style and way of life. They love their homeland. They just can't go and be there because they'll die. So a refugee is not the same as an immigrant. And these refugees coming into the United States will not want to give up their way of life. They will not want to be Americans. They want to be Afghanis. That's not a bad thing. That's not something to hold against them. And this is something we're going to see in England, like we were speaking about. That's something we're going to see in France and throughout Europe. And it's a reality. And we're not saying that's a bad thing, but it is a difference, which means tensions are going to be much higher. And because there are going to be so many more refugees in the United States, especially at least until the 2022 elections, which means January of 2023, we are going to see a massive movement by the Democratic Party that controls Congress and the Senate, the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're going to push to take in as many of these people as we can. Whereas England may take in 5,000 to 7,000 refugees in the first year, while we may see another probably 2,000 or 3,000 going into Australia. Given the failures of the Biden administration to date, given the fiasco, the Saigon-like effect of this evacuation, and the blame that's going to be directly attributed to the Biden administration because of his actions in this in Afghanistan, we're going to see probably double the number of refugees. 10 to 15,000 will be brought into the United States in the first year alone. Because it's so many, and again, while most of them I would expect to be safe, because it's so many more coming in all at once, this has a much greater impact than, say, in England, because there's such a larger influx. And they don't want to be Americans. They want to be Afghanis in America. So unless they're in very isolated areas, which is unlikely, there are going to be large frictions with them, especially at the same time that we're seeing the terrorist elements in Afghanistan targeting American citizens abroad. That's not going to be a good mix. We will see more clashes, and sadly, there will be more people who will target these refugees and blame them for what is happening from the Taliban to American citizens around the world. And that is another domino of its own that leads to 10, 15 years down the road. But then after that initial group that comes into the United States, there's going to be more and more people who want to leave the abusive, terrorist, fanatical government of the Taliban and their ideology, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, especially in the first 5 years. And so we're going to see more and more people trying to get into the United States. We're going to see a huge increase in the number of people who are going to try and illegally enter the United States through the southern border, which is wide open. At this point, in 6 months, under the Biden administration, 1.1 million people have entered the United States. That is a ridiculous number. That is incredibly high. And that's the people that we have any knowledge of. That's the numbers that we can account for, not the ones that we don't know about. Now add to this massive flood a lot of people from the Middle East, not just Afghanis, but some of the outlying regions as well, individuals from Syria, from Iraq, which will have its own problems that will be exacerbated by this situation. They're all coming in. And along with those illegal aliens, there will be some number, as there already has been, of terrorists, some known, some not known, that are going to be trying to enter illegally into the United States. And those numbers dwarf the numbers of legal immigrants into the United States, into a system in the United States that is already overwhelmed. The Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, has already stated the system is overwhelmed. They cannot keep up with these numbers. 212,000 people in just the month of July. This is too much. The cages are full. Even with midnight redistribution of all the immigrants to other states that have been going on since March, it's just not enough. There's too many people. And in a system where we are allowing people to just cross the border, as has been documented in video after video, where people are allowed to, they come to the Border Patrol, they get their name written down, they get put on a bus, and they get shipped all across the United States. They are allowed to enter into the nation, even when they have COVID, the pandemic, even when we hear Kamala Harris say, oh, stay away, they're allowed in. And the impetus to this grows with the fact that Joe Biden is going to try, and the Democratic Party, with its control, they're absolutely going to try and get a path to citizenship done before the 2020 November midterms, which means that there is a greater push to get into the United States now to be part of that path to citizenship, that path to legalization, so that they can permanently be part of the United States. Which means it's even easier for these these illegal terrorist groups to come into the United States in this greater flow. We expect that over the next 3 to 6 months, you're going to see a massive increase in the number of illegal aliens entering the United States. In that same time, in the next 3 to 6 months, we will see Democrats try to push forward and to push through Congress the path to citizenship. And that means that we will get a large number, or we will get some number of terrorists and terrorist cells into the United States at that time. It's unavoidable. It's impossible to stop. It's already happened, and it will happen even more. That means that there will be, within 5 years, at least one, if not 2 or 3, events of domestic terrorism. And when I say domestic terrorism, I don't mean white males, the far right, which is unusual and uncommon. No, what I'm talking about is from the left. Well, not even the left. These are from the fanatics. These fanatical cells will commit acts. And it's not like what most people are thinking, I don't believe. It's not the big 9/11 taking over planes and crashing them into buildings kind of an event. It's not the blowing up of buildings like the Oklahoma bombing. I think it's more of the mass shooting kind of events. Things like we saw in San Bernardino. Things like we saw in Boulder, Colorado. Things like we saw down in Florida at the Orlando shooting. It's individual or smaller events where 1 or 2 of these terrorist cells, these terrorist individuals, are going out and just shooting or driving cars, or maybe small portable pipe bombs, and they're going to be attacking American citizens that way. Something that is harder to identify as actually connected to the ISIS and Al-Qaeda directly, but also putting in more terror on an individual level everywhere throughout the nation. And the argument could be made that it's already been happening. Now, we've seen things, as I said, there's San Bernardino, there's the Orlando, Florida shooting, there's the Boulder, Colorado shootings. These are Fort Hood shootings. These are events and individuals that are all based on the radical terrorist ideology, but not considered terrorist attacks in the same way as 9/11 was, or even the Oklahoma bombing. They are acts of domestic terror because they happen in the United States, but they're not considered acts of grand terror. They're more isolated. They're mass shootings, not terrorist events. And that fine line is going to divide itself. We're going to see that change going forward. And I think over the next 5 years, we will see at least one wave of these mass shooting type events where one or two individuals are going out and killing dozens of American citizens through various means. And they're going to happen in cities across the United States, but they're not necessarily going to be attributable to the master plan, yet they're going to have many of the same similarities of being connected to a radical Islamic terrorist ideology. And that's probably going to happen within the next, at or after the second half of 2022 and going forward from there. All of this, I think, leads to Joe Biden being removed from office in 2022. Probably right after, in November of 2022, Joe Biden will be stepping down. Both out of disgrace for some of the actions that he has done, the increase in the illegal aliens in the United States, the open border in the southern border, the terrorist actions that will be happening in the United States and around the world in conjunction with Afghanistan. I think that the Republicans will win the House and the Senate with moderately strong showings, and they will try and reverse some of the things. We'll see the border at that time start to close down, that the wall will be rebuilt, that we will see funding for many things, many programs shut down that are doing international aid, and we will see a more aggressive stance, suggested by the House of Representatives and from the Senate, and rejected by Kamala Harris, who is a progressive and will be taking the opposite position, which will effectively stalemate the entire United States government, and really no policies will go forward for either party. Neither one will get anything they want, which actually helps the instability in the Middle East. It helps the terrorist organizations. They're there, and at that point will be empowered by Iran. I hope this is making sense. I'm trying to give you a very full, very clear understanding of some of the wider things that are going to happen. I can't pinpoint this day or this year. I can't tell you it's going to be in this country or that country at this time or that time. But I'm trying to give you an understanding of what we're looking at. And I'm trying to give you a clear understanding of what you can expect. Politicians are predictable. Terrorists are not. The dominoes that are falling are kind of obvious. We know these are things that are going to likely happen. We don't know when or where. And then again, they may not. But there's really almost no one in political commentary that is going to take the time to actually have this conversation with you, to tell you what they can see from the obvious dominoes that are going to fall, that these are the things that are probably going to happen. I think before 2024's election, we will see over 100, 200 people killed due to mass shootings and similar style events in the United States. I think you'll see a similar but lesser number of people who will have been killed in the United Kingdom and in France because of these terror attacks, these small-scale terror attacks done by these cells that have infiltrated. It's a terrifying thought. I think we see the instability in the Middle East, which will affect, because now that the United States is out of Afghanistan, the intense pressure to get out of Iraq is increasing. Progressives will push this. Democrats who are in control of the Congress and the Senate are going to be emphasizing this, although they're going to ask for a better plan, a more detailed plan, a step-by-step process, which is good and bad. It will not lead to another Saigon-like event, but it will detail very clearly for the more terrorist elements in Iraq exactly when the United States is leaving, exactly what areas they are going to be leaving undefended, exactly when and where they can move their troops in as the United States government moves out and the Iraqi government tries to fill that gap. That is most likely what is going to happen, which doesn't make less tension in Iraq. It makes more tension, especially as they will get troops funneled from Afghanistan and ISIS and Al-Qaeda that will be funneled directly to Iraq to fight the Iraqi government that will become weaker as the United States and the NATO forces are leaving it. And that's just because the United States has better infrastructure. We have a better military. We have a better economy. We have a better political system. So we are in a better position than the Iraq government. There will be more instability, and there is a greater weakness in their government, just like it was in Afghanistan, because they don't have the experience, they don't have the capabilities that exist in America, Great Britain, France, or Australia. That's just a fact. So that is going to give more openings for these terrorist organizations. But the pressure will be on. And before 2024, the United States will leave Iraq, though that will be yet another zone of terrorist influence. And we will see probably during 2022, the later half of 2022, I would hope, the resurgence of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We will also see the PPK, which is a terrorist organization out of Turkey. We have talked about it before on this program. They too will surge forward in protection of the Kurdish forces, the Kurdish people in Iraq. They're going to try and protect them, and they are a terrorist organization to Turkey. And because of the other influences in Iraq that are against the Kurds, they're going to flare up, and they're going to be another organization. Now, this is important because within 5 years, actually within 2 years from today, I expect that we will see a division between Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, the PPK, and certain other smaller factions. And they're going to fight amongst themselves. The problem is, while they're fighting amongst themselves in their borders of areas that they're going to be trying to define, they're also going to be expanding. So it's not something where they're going to just stop and fight each other and then go forward. They're going to fight each other and expand at the same time. The thought being that whichever terrorist group has the largest arena, largest area of control, the largest area of influence will eventually be the one that wins them all. But that's what we're going to see. So I do expect to see fighting between Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Iran and some of its elements, Hamas and the Taliban and the PPK. At the end of the day, they're still all going to grow in their various directions. You're going to see ISIS more into the Iraqi arena, that along with Syria. You're going to see more of the Taliban influence in southern Afghanistan. You're going to see the Al-Qaeda influence more towards Pakistan and northern Afghanistan. The PPK is in northern Iraq, going into Turkey. So they have regions that are somewhat separated and yet touch on each other, and they will expand from there. Taking advantage of all of this will be China, more than any other organization. Not so much Russia, which will take some benefit from this. Not so much Iran although they will be acting through their agents. North Korea, not really at all. It will be China, because they will have a new outlet, a new source for their economic growth. They have positioned themselves for that, and this is in their best interest, because most of these organizations, these terrorist groups, are not targeting China or Chinese interests. They're targeting the West. They're targeting Europe. They're targeting the United States. They're targeting Australia, all the places that China wants to see weaker. In the short term, over the next decade, China doesn't care. They will benefit from this. And let me finish this by saying that I believe within roughly about a decade, we will see a new Middle East war. We will see the children who have suffered not from the 20 years of the United States being there, and not necessarily from the Taliban's harsh rule, although that will be part of it, but it will be the children who lost their mothers, their fathers, their brothers and sisters because of what the United States has done, because of the dominoes that have fallen, because women will be killed because they can read, because they can drive a car, because they had jobs. Because those women will be killed, their children will grow up resenting the fact that it was because the United States, the Biden administration, did this. The Biden administration ran away, and they let the Taliban come in and kill little Timmy's mom. And he's going to hate Biden for that. He's going to hate the Americans for that, because they killed his mom when they ran away, and no one was there to help his mom. And that kid's going to grow up, and in a decade, and there are going to be many of those kids, little Muhammad's going to grow up, and he's going to be angry because his brother or his uncle got killed because they were LGBTQ. And when the Americans who said that was okay, and the Americans who said they encouraged that, and the British and the French and the Australians who all said that's okay and let him be that way, and maybe even encouraged him to be that way, when they ran away, well, the Taliban came in and killed him because they said it's not okay. And rather than blaming the Taliban, they're going to blame the people who ran away, the United States. They're going to blame Biden because he ran away. And that's what got, after 2 decades of telling their little brother, their little sister, their uncle or aunts that it's okay to be LGBTQ, and to encourage that, they then ran away and left them alone, and they got killed. Those kids are growing up, and in 10 years, they will be adults, and they are angry, and they will be more than willing to go and strike out against America and our allies, because we did this to them. We caused them that pain. The Taliban may be the ones inflicting the pain, but it's because the United States allowed the Taliban to do that. And so those kids are going to form up either with some of the various groups. I think you'll see Al-Qaeda fail. You'll see ISIS grow and absorb Al-Qaeda into itself. You'll see some frictions with the Taliban, but essentially the Taliban will maintain southern Afghanistan and just stay there. Hamas will grow. The PPK will grow. So those are the lines, and we will see a new ISIS attack. We will see a new growth of ISIS throughout the Middle East, and that will trigger another war with the United States. They will come after the United States in a large way in a decade with these new fresh troops who are angry at Biden and angry at the United States because we abandoned them. And that then sets the cycle all back in again. That's what I believe will happen. It's kind of detailed, but kind of not detailed. I'm sure there are elements of this you may or may not agree. I'm trying to be exact in ways that I can, but it's not exactly perfect. You're looking forward. There are events that we cannot predict. But I think in general, these things will happen. And we will see them in generally this time frame. And this is what we can expect. And sadly, I don't see how we avoid any of these consequences. But I do ask, if you think that there is a way to stop these consequences, if there is some way to circumvent these things, if there is some way to create the political will to stand up and be prepared to counter these things, please let me know. Please share this if you think any elected official who has the capability to try and stop this, who may not be aware or has not taken into account these consequences in the future, please share it with them. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this from wherever you are in the world. It affects Britain, it affects France, it affects the United States and Australia. And I know I haven't gotten into great detail on those countries, and I wish to hear from people. If you are in Australia, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and I would like to hear, what do you think about what I said? Do you think this is the way it's going to affect your country? Or are there things that I've missed? Are there aspects that are going to make this either more likely or less likely? Or what time frame do you think it will happen? I want to hear from you. Because if we're not working together on this, and if we're not thinking and trying to plan for this, it will be much worse. Just like when the United States, when Joe Biden didn't plan for the evacuation and just ran away, he made it much worse than just leaving. But I thank you for taking this time with me to go through this story, to go through this concept, this theory, and to see what may be some of the consequences and what might be some of the time frames. We hope to see you every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to share with us in our live stream. And until then, we hope everyone will be safe and everyone will be well. Thank you.